Hey guys, welcome and happy Veterans Day. Yes, if you're watching this, it's at a very special time, 11 o'clock, for a very special occasion. And this is a very special edition of Intrepid Live Adventures. It's part of our live programming here at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, located at the heart of Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, right on the Hudson River. Um, and if you're watching this, you are a part of that program. And we're about to learn uh, of four special aircraft in our collection, four of my favorites, and some stories about some veterans who flew them as well. But before we do that, a little background information. That, just so you remember, is the Intrepid Museum. Make it a little bit bigger for you there. That is as it currently looks, sitting on the Hudson River today at the end of Pier 86. And if you take it just as it is right there, it's about 9 stories tall, but it's a pretty big place. So if you take it and ask the Intrepid to do a headstand, it will stand about 913 feet tall. And that's about as tall as a lot of our skyscrapers here in New York City. You can, just as it sits there, just about almost play 3 football games. So you can play 2 comfortably, including the end zones and some of the crowd and sidelines as well. Okay. Once again, this is part of our live programming, but it does not come free. So if you would think about we would like you to consider supporting us. And if you would like to do that, just hit the link in the chat there before. So the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, again, an aircraft carrier that was in service during 3 wars. The World War II, in this picture that you can see right there, kind of black and white, kind of gives you the idea. That's a little bit of an older picture. Through the latter half of World War II, served also in the Cold War and in the Vietnam War as well. Served for 31 years overall before being decommissioned in 1974, after being commissioned in 1943. All right. So let's get on right away to our first aircraft. It is my actual favorite aircraft that we have here, and you can see it up on the flight deck. This is our A-12, okay? The A standing for Archangel. We're going to go through that a little bit of the reasons why. But we're going to start our story in 1957. Now, in 1957, the CIA formed a committee to select a successor to this right there. Let me zoom in a little bit for you guys. There you go. That is the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, or the spy plane. Okay, big, long, straight-winged airplane, flew about 500 miles per hour, so subsonic, not as fast as the speed of sound, but it did fly at 70,000 feet high, which was thought too high for Soviet SAMs, or surface-to-air missiles, to reach. Unfortunately, the CIA was proven wrong on May 1st, 1960, when pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. So, um, Lockheed in 1958, they began designing an aircraft that would meet the CIA's new specifications and requirements, something that could cruise at a minimum of Mach 3. Sorry about that. Something that can cruise at a minimum of Mach 3, right, which is 3 times the speed of sound. It could fly above 90,000 feet. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is this was the patch of the Lockheed Skunk Works. Okay, it's a facility out on a place called Loon Lake, better known by some as Area 51. Okay, out in Nevada. That's where they were developing a secret aircraft like this. And this is, of course, the area where it's rumored that the United States has some wrecked UFOs, alien spacecraft, maybe even some dead bodies of aliens, maybe even some live aliens there helping us advance our technology. I don't know. So aircraft like the A-12 um, and a couple of others are thought maybe the sources of some of these UFO sightings. I don't know. I still think there's aliens. Okay. Now, the Lockheed, back to their new aircraft, they're actually going to exceed the CIA's expectations. Now, they wanted something a minimum of Mach 3, and that could fly above 90,000 feet. So, with their aircraft that they're going to designate Archangel, okay. See, the U program U2 was named Angel. If you're going to make something better than Angel, You're going to make an Archangel. So with their various configurations, which they named Archangel 1, Archangel 2, or simply A1 and A2, all the way up to A12. A12 was the actual one that was put into production and that satisfied the CIA's regulations. Okay, they're going to, like I said, exceed the CIA's expectation. This aircraft that you're looking at here was capable of flying at 98,500 feet in the air and at a top speed of Mach 3.3. That means 3.3 times the speed of sound, 3.3 times the sound of my voice coming out of your speakers reaching your ear. Okay, that's uh, that's pretty darn fast, right? The engines that had to power these things, now as you might expect, they had to be pretty powerful and pretty advanced. This aircraft was powered by two Pratt& and Whitney J58 engines, which allowed Lockheed to push this aircraft to its maximum speed of that Mach 3.3. Okay. Now these engines were so powerful that just one of these, and there were two, put out 160,000 horsepower. By comparison, the cars that most people drive around in have about 180 to 200 horsepower. Okay, unless you have a sporty model like a Porsche or something, they go a little bit higher than that. Also, by comparison, this is one of the big bronze propellers that was on the back of the Intrepid here when it was in service. One of four, as I said, to push this ship through the ocean. All four of those pushing this aircraft carrier through the ocean produced 150,000 horsepower. So not even as much with all four of these propellers than one of those engines that was on the A12. Okay. So the project was given the code name, and is a very random code name from the CIA's list of code names of Oxcart. Again, just a random list of code names. Okay. So yeah, that was just a random code name. So it became synonymous with the name of the plane as well, along with Archangel. So you can call it the A12, the Archangel, or the Oxcart. Both are appropriate. Now, the fuel tank held about 11,000 gallons. As you might understand, this is a very fuel-hungry beast. So 11,000 gallons of fuel tank. And fuel was used at about 22,000 pounds of fuel per hour, which means it had to be refueled in midair several times during its mission. Now, the pilot's cockpit was not insulated from the extreme heat of friction. So, if you want to know, do a quick experiment with me as far as friction. I want you to take your hands and you can just put them together like I'm doing here and rub your hands together. You don't have to go very fast before they start doing what? They are, of course, heating up. So that's friction. Can you imagine if you can rub your hands together at Mach 3.3, the amount of heat that you would incur on your hands? Okay, your hands would probably burn up. So that's the kind of friction that we were talking about with this aircraft moving through the air. So with that kind of a danger of friction, um, they were going to have to do something special. It was going to have to be made out of special materials. So it couldn't be made out of steel. It would be way too heavy. It also couldn't be made out of aluminum because that was had a low melting point and would just soften up and the aircraft will fly apart, right? It had to be made out of a special substance, and that special metal was called titanium. Okay, so it was made out of very special titanium alloy, and that allowed the aircraft to withstand those high heat, the high heat of friction. Now, although the cockpit was not insulated from the heat of friction, the cockpit alone would get about 5 to 600 degrees. It apparently was air conditioned down to about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. But the pilot was still required to wear a spacesuit to protect himself from that large amount of heat. And there was some speculation as to how well the air conditioning worked in that cockpit. Right. Um, the rest of the aircraft, for example, the wings, could experience as much as 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is above the melting point of aluminum. So you can see right there why it needed to be something different. Okay. Now, this guy is Ken Collins. He is one of the Oxcart drivers. Okay, that's what they call the pilots, and former Air Force pilot, so a veteran to be honored on Veterans Day. He's one of the ones that we're going to talk about. To be an ox cart driver, to fly the A-12, you had to be a currently qualified Air Force pilot with at least 2,000 hours of flight experience. At least 1,000 of those had to be in high performance fighter jets. You must be married. You must be emotionally stable. You must be well motivated. You must be between 25 and 40 years old, under 6 feet tall, and under 175 pounds in order to fit into that very small cockpit. It was pretty cramped. Um, so we have a little story about Ken Collins. He fit all the qualifications. A typical surveillance mission would last about 4 hours, and you weren't allowed to bring food on that mission as well. I mean, just imagine for some of the reasons why you can't eat a lot of things in your space capsule, especially the early space capsules that we cover in some of the other um, topics here on this program, Intrepid Adventures. Crumbs are a problem if they get in the works. So for the same reason, you weren't allowed to bring bread or really any kind of food on your mission. But Ken Collins kind of did something special. Before he was ready to go up, he made a grilled cheese sandwich and he wrapped it in aluminum foil and kind of tucked it down in there in that spacesuit that you see. So nobody knew he was bringing it on board. So he climbed into the cockpit. And during the middle of his mission, when he was way up high at 98,000 feet or so, and he was flying at approximately the speed of Mach 3, and his A-12 was getting all hot, and from all that friction, he just simply reached into his spacesuit, took out that grilled cheese sandwich, stuck it on the glass of his cockpit, and heated up pretty nicely. So he had himself a nice, melty grilled cheese sandwich for lunch. Um, did he leave evidence? Of course, he left evidence. He probably got in a bit of trouble, but at least he had a decent lunch. Right? Now, the A-12s, there were about 15 of those made. 6 of them were lost in training accidents, but not one of them was shot down. Now, this A-12, it set records for air-breathing piloted jets, okay, at just over 2,500 miles per hour. It could fly, for example, from San Francisco to New York City, a trip that usually will take 5.5 hours or so, in just over an hour, about 70 minutes. That is pretty fast, right? All right, so that is our A-12 and a story about Ken Collins. We're going to pause quickly, see if there's any questions out there. Are there any questions? What was the A-12 made of? Okay, so we kind of covered that a little bit. It was made of a titanium alloy. This way it could be light enough so it could get off the ground, but it had a high enough melting point that the structure would stay together. But the interesting story is where the titanium came from. So most of the domestic titanium that was here in the United States, about 95% of it was inadequate for the type of alloy they wanted. They needed something pure, more pure than the ones we had here in the US. So the purest form of titanium, it turns out, was in a place called the Soviet Union. Today we call it Russia. Back then, of course, that is when we were in. That is was our Cold War adversary at the time. Uh, being that as our adversary, they weren't exactly going to give us or even sell us this titanium so that we can take it and put it into our spy planes and spy on them and their allies. So the CIA had to form dummy or fake corporations that were non-allied with the United States and non-American companies. For example, they would go to the Soviets as a Swiss watch manufacturing company, and they would go and say, "We need your titanium for our watches." A South African golf club manufacturer saying that they needed the titanium for the golf clubs, and the Soviets would sell them the titanium, not knowing they're really selling it to the CIA, bring back the titanium to the United States, ultimately put it in the A-12, and the successor to it, which we'll talk about in a second, um, and spy on the Soviets and their allies. Okay, kind of a cool story. Is there another question? Any other questions? So what were the differences between the A-12 and the SR-71? Okay, very good. So the SR-71, the more popular of the two aircraft. Um, it's a good time to answer that question. We were gonna so the A-12 was in use for just a little over a year, 1967 to 1968, uh, to fly over North Vietnam in the Vietnam War. So when the Intrepid was in service, what they call on station off the coast of North Vietnam, no doubt A-12s would have flown over the Intrepid on its way to take pictures of the North Vietnamese and their capabilities. It never did fly over the Soviet Union. It was really thought that by then the Soviet Union surface-to-air missile capability was good enough to reach the A-12. So they didn't want to risk it. So they just used it for North Vietnam. Okay. Now the difference is, or in late 1968, excuse me, the SR-71 took over. Now, whereas the U-2 and the A-12 were CIA operations, non-military, which is why the Oxcart drivers had to um, uh, resign their commissions from the Air Force. The SR-71 was an Air Force program. Okay, so they were Air Force pilots that actually flew them. Right. Other differences were where the A-12 had one cockpit, the SR-71 had two. So it would be a pilot in the first one, and the one a little bit behind that one was where the surveillance operator would be, and it's his job to take the pictures. Okay, leaving the pilot free to just fly the plane. It was a little broader and a little wider, so making it heavier, making it not as fast as the A-12. So to this day, the A-12 still the fastest jet-powered piloted aircraft ever invented. Right? Okay, let's move on to our next aircraft. We're going to talk about our F-8 Crusader. This one right there, also one of my favorite aircraft that we have here in the collection. Now, it's made by Vought Aviation. The Vought Crusader was one of the first types of supersonic jets to serve on aircraft carriers like the Intrepid throughout the Vietnam War. Now, it first became operational in 1955, and it's the last American fighter aircraft designed with guns as its primary weapon. Hence, it gained the nickname the last gunfighter. Right? It actually set a world record in 1956 as the first operationally equipped jet aircraft to fly at 1,000 miles per hour. So it went about roughly Mach 1.5. 1.5 times the speed of sound. In 1957, future astronaut John Glenn flew a reconnaissance version of the Crusader, setting a record time for a transcontinental flight. He flew from Los Alamos Naval Air Station in California to Floyd Bennett Field here in Brooklyn, New York, in just 3.5 hours. So clear across country in 3.5 hours. Not too bad. Now, the Crusader made history aboard the USS Intrepid from 1967 to 1969 with Fighter Squadron 111. So that would be VF 111. So fighter squadrons designated with the letters VF and then their number, also known as the Sundowners. Now, the name Sundowners was originally coined by Fighter Squadron 11 during World War II in 1942 to exemplify their spirit and technical superiority over the Imperial Japanese. The squadron then chose their own insignia and artwork, as you can see in their patch here, depicting two fighter aircraft shooting down the rising sun, which was the symbol of Imperial Japan. Now, one of the most interesting features of the A-12, of the F-8 that we have here on the flight deck of Intrepid is the nose here, and you can see the nose art that it's called is pretty, could be pretty intimidating. You see the shark teeth and the evil eyes. I want you to imagine you're a soldier on the ground, and all of a sudden, out of the clouds, spitting bullets, comes a jet aircraft, which would be scary enough. But if that aircraft has shark teeth and evil eyes staring you down, it could get even more scary. All right. Um, Now the squadron or the nose art became as was originally begun for practical purposes. Okay. And it was the one that you just saw on the F-8 was modeled after the famous Flying Tigers, the volunteer American aviators that went to help defend China against the Imperial Japanese before the United States got into the war. So you can see the resemblance there. Okay. So again, it was started back in World War I, and it was meant to demoralize the enemy. Okay. But it evolved to express individuality, often constrained by the military, to evoke memories of home and peaceful life. Now, the appeal came um, uh, from those art not actually being officially approved, okay, although the regulations against it were ignored, all right, not strictly enforced. Um, Now, World War II was considered the golden age of nose art, with artists, both civilian and military, paid well for their work. Now, it was tolerated by the U.S. Army Air Corps, which later would become the U.S. Air Force, but not by the Navy. So it was much more accepted by the Air Force. Post World War II, nose art reappeared in the Korean and Vietnam Wars on aircraft like the Crusader. And if you take a look here, the Imperial Japanese Rising Sun can be seen on the tail of the Crusader. And that was to pay homage to VF-11, the original Sundowners from World War II. The shark mouth was added in the 1960s by VF-111 on the Crusader and was inspired by those flying tigers that I showed you before. It followed the squadron through the F-4 Phantom, which would be their aircraft of choice after the F-8. Also, the F-14 Tomcat, which be their next aircraft after the F-4 Phantom. Okay, or after 53 years of service, the Sundowners were disestablished on March 31st, 1995. Right? That's the story of our Sundowners and our F8 Crusader. Do we have any questions about the F8? How was Nozat started? Okay, yeah. So I kind of alluded to it a little bit. In World War One, to demoralize the enemy, and it evolved after that in all the ways I showed you or I told you. But interestingly enough, the practice was originated by Italian and German pilots who painted mouths underneath the propellers of their planes in World War One. Okay, um, to demoralize, it was also to evoke memories of home and thoughts of what they were missing while they were in their service. Right? Good question. Okay, let's move on to aircraft number 3, and that is this guy here, okay? Um, it's our UH Iroquois. Now, in keeping with the theme of naming Army helicopters after Native American tribes, it is the UH Iroquois, okay? But because of the UNH, our guys started calling it the UE. It was first used in the late 1950s, and variations of it are still in use to this day within the US military and other nations throughout the world. So, very successful design. This one that we have here on the flight deck of the Intrepid is the earliest version of the UE and is smaller than those that were used later on. Though UEs never flew off the flight deck of the Intrepid, they are widely recognized as perhaps the most famous aircraft of the Vietnam War. Now, originally designed as a utility helicopter, hence the U and the H in its name, it was so successful that they made a number of different variations, from training to transporting soldiers and supplies to medical evacuations, and even the first ever helicopter gunship. Okay, you see a medical evac version here on your screen now. Now, the rotors of the UE made a very distinctive sound and served as a godsend for many US soldiers in Vietnam as confirmation that help was on its way. Unfortunately, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong also learned the sound and were sometimes able to prepare for the UE's arrival. On November 14th, 1965, Army Major Bruce Crandall was the lead pilot of 16 UEs bringing soldiers to a landing zone known as X-Ray in the Le Drang Valley. Now, this would become the first major battle of the Vietnam War and would be later referred to as Death Valley. Crandall and his flight were transporting soldiers to the valley when, as one soldier put it, all hell broke loose. The battle had begun early, possibly the sound of the rotors alerting the enemy. After the flight discharged their combat units, the ferocity of the battle made it very difficult for the UEs to return, leaving the soldiers on the ground without aerial support and transport. Crandall had completed his mission, but he wanted to do more. Knowing troops on the ground needed help, Crandall and his wingman, Ed Freeman, went back again and again, spending the next 14 hours providing the troops with much needed supplies and taking out wounded soldiers. Crandall even used his Huey with its thin walls as a shield to prevent soldiers from getting hit. He wound up having to use a total of 3 Hueys, having 2 of them shot out from under him. They were so badly damaged. He flew a total of 20 flights, rescuing 70 wounded soldiers. And for his actions on that day, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President George W. Bush. Right? Just another one of our veterans that we are honoring on this Veterans Day. Do we have any questions about the Huey? Was the Huey successful as a gunship? Okay, good question. You might think it was, since it was such a successful design, that it would be successful in all of its versions or its variants, but it really wasn't. And if you take a look at the Huey closely, you'll see why. It's a pretty big aircraft. Even the smaller version, which is what we have here at the Intrepid, was still a wide target. In other words, not too hard to hit or to aim at. Another one of its problems was it was very lightly armored. The first versions, in fact, had no armor at all, so not very much protection for the crew that flew it, or the soldiers that were being transported to and from battles. Later versions would be armored a little bit more, but those made it just too heavy and slow. So it didn't. So the gunship variant wasn't a very successful variant for that particular aircraft. Okay, good question. Going on to our final aircraft for the day, we're going to talk about our F-16 Fighting Falcon. Okay, this aircraft is still being used today by the U.S. Air Force and our allies around the world. It also is the aircraft of choice for the Air Force's precision flying team, the Thunderbirds. Now, the Navy also has a precision flying team. They're called the Blue Angels. And as you might imagine, there's a rivalry between the two teams. I know for a fact that the Blue Angels call the Thunderbirds the Thunder Chickens. Now, many of you might be a little young to have any memories of September 11, 2001. But no doubt you know about it and you've learned it in school. Our next story about our next veteran that we're going to honor on this Veterans Day has to do with those 9/11 attacks. Now, as you know, 2 terrorist-controlled commercial airliners crashed into the Twin Towers, one into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. But I want to talk about today that fourth one. That was United Airlines Flight 93. It was a Boeing 757 flying out of Newark, New Jersey on its way to San Francisco. Now, on duty with the Washington, D.C. Air National Guard was Colonel Mark Sassville and this woman here, Lieutenant Heather Lucky Penny. Now, Lucky was a natural nickname for someone with the last name of Penny. However, you can't give yourself your own nickname. Your squadron had to give it to you. So they gave her that nickname, Lucky. Now, she had just graduated 2 weeks before from combat flight school. And the two were in a meeting when the first airliner hit the tower, the first twin tower here in Manhattan. So it wasn't until the second airliner hit that they knew the country was under attack. But although the two were eager to perform their duty, they were frustrated by the lack of authorization to launch. It wouldn't be until the third hijacked airliner hit the Pentagon that they got authorization to take to the skies. Colonel Sassville said, quote, "Lucky, you're with me." And the two ran down the hall to get their flight gear. Now, they weren't an air defense alert squadron, so they didn't have live weapons on their F-16s, and because of the urgency of the day, had no time to arm their F-16s. They had to get airborne. Now, they realized that they may indeed be on a one-way mission. Now, Mark Sassville said, "I'll take out the cockpit." Penny said, "I'll ram the tail." They briefly discussed aiming for their targets and ejecting at the last minute, but they had to make sure. So they needed to stay behind their yokes and fly straight into Flight 93. Missing wasn't an option. Now the two took off, flying low over the countryside, searching for Flight 93, which they would never find. They were what is called mission failure. It seems the passengers had taken things into their own hands and prevented the airliner from being used as a fourth weapon of terror. They circled back to DC. You can see on this map that it was landing, it crashed in Shankville, Pennsylvania. But Penny and Sassville circled back to DC just to make sure that they weren't outflanked. And in fact, they spent the rest of the day protecting the Capitol and even escorting President Bush back into Washington, D.C. Now, guys, months later, it came out that Lieutenant Penny got her inspiration from her father, who was also a veteran, a retired Air Force pilot from Vietnam, who was now a commercial airline pilot, who now flew for United Airlines and usually flew for that route flight 93 from Newark out to San Francisco. He wasn't scheduled on that route that Tuesday morning, but his daughter, Lieutenant Penny, had no way to be sure. Can you imagine what was going on in her head knowing I have to crash into my father's airplane? I would like to say that um, at least at least in that instance, she was one of the very few people where her nickname Lucky came into account, right? Um, do we have any questions about F-16s? Was the Intrepid Museum awarded for allowing the NYPD and FBI to use their facilities? Ah, yes. Okay, good question. So, yeah, shortly after the president of the Intrepid Museum would be contacted by the NYPD's terrorist control force um, to possibly use our facilities here as their headquarters. You see, their headquarters were located downtown in the World Trade Center site, so it actually was taken down by the terrorists on that day. So, of course, the president immediately agreed. Now, if you think about it, the Intrepid was a natural option for the FBI and the NYPD to use. It's not connected to the mainland. It's a hardened target, right, with our armored hull and flight deck. And speaking of the flight deck, it had a nice a nice flat top there, where FBI and FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency helicopters could land and take off all day long. And I'm told there were 700 FBI agents working and or sleeping on the Intrepid. I'm not sure where. I'm picturing sleeping bags on the hangar deck. Um, but because they were allowed to use the Intrepid as the headquarters, okay, um, the Intrepid was eventually awarded a 12-foot long twisted I-beam that was part of the wreckage from the Twin Towers. And if you come to the Intrepid today, you can see that at the end of the pier, not on the ship, but at the end of the pier, right around where you can see the Concorde. And it is actually a part of our memorial to what happened on that day, 9/11, and part of our homage to veterans that serves, right? Okay, guys, so I hope you enjoyed our little paying of respect here to our veterans on this special edition of Intrepid Adventures. Please tag us in your social media posts. If you want, you can take a tour of the Intrepid without even leaving your home. Just go to Google Arts and Culture. You can see the link there. Okay. Don't forget to visit our website to sign up for our next family program. We do these every Thursday at 3 o'clock. Speaking of Thursday at 3 o'clock, later on today, if you're watching this on Veterans Day, don't forget to tune in for our live streaming of the Intrepid's Veterans Day ceremony. And guys, if you still have questions, don't forget to email us at community@intrepidmuseum.org. That being said, guys, we will see you next time on Intrepid Adventures. Take care, guys. Bye bye.